Welcome back to our course. First, in this course, we showed you the standard economics introductory course and how it teaches really only one of the many schools of economic thought, a very simplified and purified view of neoclassical economics. We looked at the history and development of neoclassical economics, and we saw how the foundational assumptions of human nature and market function don't really seem to hold in the real world. Then we saw how the policy prescriptions and the business best practices suggested by neoclassical economics have failed historically. So, although you only get neoclassical economics in a standard introductory course, we also saw how professional economists, almost zero of them, really believe that the economy actually works in the way that a standard intro course teaches. This gives the students of economics a misleading representation of the real state of economic knowledge. Really, most working economists might use some neoclassical understandings, maybe the production function or utility functions or marginalist analysis, but they combine this with many other schools of economic thought. So now we're going to go and start to talk about those other economic thoughts and other schools. We're going to start with institutional economics in Module 5. This module will have two parts. Part 1 will talk about old institutional economics, and Part 2 will talk about new institutional economics. One thing I want to make clear is that old institutional economics, although it started earlier, it's not antiquated. It's actually increasingly starting to replace what had become new institutional economics. So keep that in mind when we're discussing these types of institutional economics. So when you're discussing institutional economics, it would be important to understand what economists mean by an institution. So here's an official definition. An institution is the regular pattern behavior of people in a society and the ideas and values associated with these regularities. Institutions are built through communication and interaction, not just through prices. Now, this is a little abstract, so let's kind of try and talk ourselves through it a little bit. An institution are any of those things that are not the market, that humans build. We've got a lot of them, right? And when humans create things, you can think of a local government or anything like that, they speak with one another and they interact with each other. Neoclassical economics, if you look closely to the theory, it presumes that the only way the human actor, this Homo economicus creature, interacts with other humans is through prices. It sees the price of something and says, yeah, I'll buy that for that much. And that's the extent of human interaction. Institutional economists say, wow, humans actually, not only do they talk to one another and interact with one another, but they build kind of constructs with one another, and those constructs, institutions, will affect the economy. Let's make this more clear through examples. Okay, so here's one of the primal, maybe the primal institution of economics, of society, and that's language. Now, some people, when they think about language, they feel like, okay, language, maybe that's a tool that we formed in order to do stuff like be in the economy and do trade. And yeah, it is. It does facilitate trade. So you cannot have trade in a market really without a way of communicating with other people. Very few markets just have prices and people kind of nod, right? So that's fundamentally important. But language does more than just this. And to understand this, you have to look at the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis from sociology. Now, what does that hypothesis say? Language determines a native speaker's perception and categorization of experience. This includes preferences and utility functions. So when we're born as humans, we don't have language, and we learn language as we develop. What language does, for those who have really studied it, is it takes the world and it categorizes it and divides it and tells stories about it. And from that categorization and storytelling, you get to understand some concepts, some things that are real, and kind of ignore other things that aren't really described in your language. They also, of course, tell us what's good, what's bad, what's yummy, what's yucky, and those sorts of things. So language contributes to the development of our preferences, the things that we want. And of course, economists, neoclassical economists, add up our preferences in these things they call utility functions that each of us has. It's the sum of all of our preferences. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis suggests that the institution of language gives us our utility functions, our preferences. And maybe you can understand it this way. If maybe you speak two languages and you've been trying to explain a concept in English to somebody, and there comes a point where you stop and you say, I can't really explain this to you because there's no word in English that really describes this concept, so I can't make you understand. That's a good example of how language formats our understanding. There are just some things that some ideas that some languages just don't have. Does that impact your economic behavior and how markets function? Many economists say, yeah, it must impact it in one way or another. Now, related to language is this idea, this institution, culture. Obviously, they're related. Really, culture is made up of language in a lot of ways. To understand how culture impacts us, let's look at a couple of quotes. The first is from the very prestigious economist Carla Hoff. We all jump to narratives, and culture shapes them. They influence how we interpret actions and how we think and how we behave. So the neoclassical model of a human is this Homo economicus creature that just wants to maximize its utility function, and its utility function and preferences are set in stone and they don't change, right? That's that economic model taught in Econ 101. Carla Hoff here suggests, well, no, culture influences our preferences and how we behave and how we perceive the rules of the economic game, and how we interact in market settings in any economy. Alan Watts develops this further. We seldom realize, for example, that our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own, for we think in terms of languages and images that we did not invent, but which were given to us by our society. So we're products of society. Culture creates us, creates our markets, creates our perceptions, creates our preferences. It's important to realize that these narratives and cultures, and therefore our utility functions and preferences, change continually as humans communicate. Humans don't just communicate when we're babies and then stop. Cultures just don't develop as when we're babies and then stop. We continually reevaluate how we interpret the world and our likes and our dislikes, and this is done in and outside of markets. So culture is always changing and always changing how markets work. So economists should study that. The family is an institution. The very prominent economists Alesina and Gilano suggest that the structure of the family relationships influences economic behavior and attitudes. So you want to know how an economy works, you can look at the family and see how that influences the economy. Religion. Clearly connected with culture, religious beliefs influence the traits that enhance economic performance in some studies, by Barrow and McCleary, for example. Other studies have found that some religious institutions impede economic performance. Some studies have found that various religions change the goals of society so that economic performance might not be the thing they care so much about. Maybe it's welfare and happiness and things like that. So if we want to use economics broadly as the study of trade and the study of making choices under constraint, well, we want to know what choices people value. And what are the constraints? And religion gives us a lot of those constraints. It's worthy of study. Markets themselves are an institution. We've discussed this before. First, markets are created by humans. They don't naturally appear. Markets need some sort of collective governance or government to create them. We know this. But another thing that economists have noticed is being involved in markets or market systems can change your preferences and habits. You might be very cooperative in one situation, and then a market system is imposed, for example, in your rural community, and you suddenly become very competitive and cutthroat. That is a socialization of you by the institution of the market. The market itself has changed your preferences for cooperation or competitiveness in this instance, and it might change other preferences as well. So we should study how markets impact human culture and human behavior. Government, that's the institution most people think of when first you say the word institution. And of course, we've already discussed this point. Here's the quote from Robert Reich. A market, any market, requires that government make and enforce the rules of the game. Government doesn't intrude on the free market, it creates the market. The rules are neither neutral nor universal, and they aren't permanent. Governments create economic systems. That's how we get them. Governments create markets, and they create them in multiple different forms. So we better understand how governments function to see how a market or any type of economy would function. Schools are another one. That's one of the most common institutions, of course, and they all tend to have a thing called a hidden curriculum. Schools are important for markets because of their overt curriculum. Businesses do not want to spend the money to train their own workforces, for example, in literacy, numeracy, basic accounting, things like that. So they rely on the government usually, if it's a publicly funded school system, businesses rely on the government in order to create that workforce that's competent. And the government collects taxes in order to operate that system that creates the workers that the businesses then use for free. They have to pay the workers, but they don't have to compensate the government for training the workers other than paying their taxes. So that's one way, of course, that schools are a very important institution for any economy. Now, schools also carry this hidden curriculum, however. A good example might be your standard introduction to economics course that you take in any college or university. We have studies, behavioral studies, that have found that students, after they take that intro course, which of course is based on neoclassical economics and Homo economicus model of humanity, after students take that intro course, they become more competitive and less cooperative. That shouldn't be a surprise because it teaches that humans are greedy, and that greed is good because markets synthesize greed into social good using that neoclassical model. So it shouldn't be surprised that students become more greedy and more selfish and more apt to cheat and things like that on exams as they learn more economics from after they take an Economics 101 course. But there's also a hidden curriculum in all schools, right? A hidden curriculum is a covert pattern of action that prepares students for the workplace and other social spheres as the transmission of social values becomes accepted by students, influencing their future economic behaviors and expectations. This happens all throughout the school system, of course, not just in that Economics 101 class. Then, of course, law. That's a big institution. Law creates private property in the first place, and therefore you need it to have a market. Markets aren't natural. You need a law to create them. Not all the people are really happy about this idea of private property, and it may be surprising to you that Adam Smith really didn't like the idea in a lot of circumstances either. And here's a quote from Adam Smith. As soon as the land of any country has all become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they have never sowed, and demand a rent for even its natural produce. Adam Smith didn't like all private property. And this is the father of economics. Many would say the father of neoclassical economics. So those are examples of different types of institutions that institutional economists tend to consider when they're doing their analysis. And we'll see how they're important now. So let's talk about what an economy is and what an economy isn't. Now, according to neoclassical economics, an economy is the natural result of rational, self-interested humans. You're greedy, you're self-interested, you want more of what you want, you will barter and exchange with whoever you see. For that set a price, boom, that's a market. It's a naturally occurring system according to neoclassical economics. Therefore, it follows that any institution that interferes with that natural system is a distortion and is not rational. It will cause an inefficiency if any institution interferes, whether that's a community group or a government. Neoclassical economics presumes that there is no such thing as society, in other words. And this is actually a quote from former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was at the forefront of promoting neoliberal policy in the 1980s that was based on neoclassical economics. She said, "The only thing that's real is a market. There's no such thing as institutions. And if there are institutions, they might be interfering with the market, and we shouldn't let them do that." Now, institutional economists have a very different idea of what an economy is. It's defined as an institution, right? It's a social organization related to the production and distribution and consumption of goods. Yes, so it's related to the production, distribution, and consumption of goods, an economy, but it's a social organization. What does that mean? It's created by society. It doesn't create society. And it is one of many social institutions that are made up. And it's made up of many social institutions as well. It's embedded. That's that concept of embeddedness. So it's not natural. It's another social institution, and it needs social institutions to function. Market failure and interference, that doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense, that institutions would create inefficiencies in a market, because a market is a human-constructed institution. So old institutional economics has multiple concepts related to that definition of what an economy is. The first is embeddedness. Economic analysis must be grounded in cultural, political, and social circumstances. Since economies and people act differently and function differently in different cultural, political, and social circumstances, you have to understand those things in order to understand markets. So economists have to understand basic sociology, anthropology, right? Political science. They have to understand those things to even depict the economy properly. A free capitalist market is an institution that's built by other institutions. It doesn't naturally exist, and it can't function without other institutions. In other words, old institutional economists suggest that there is no such thing as a free market. They also insist that there are socialized preferences. Preferences aren't sort of naturally given to you by your DNA or God or whatever. That the things you like that make up the preferences that make up your utility function are socialized into you. There is no such thing as a man with pre-social preferences, for example, other than maybe they like a certain amount of salt and a certain amount of sugar. Institutions actually create preferences. So Homo sociologicus is empirically consistent with reality. We've seen it out there. We've measured it. We've seen how it works. While Homo economicus is just a theoretical abstraction that has never actually been observed in the real human world. It doesn't exist. So those are two of the main concepts that are common from old institutional economics. And that generated a bunch of important ideas. We'll talk about three of them. And they're everywhere, not even in economies 100 years ago. They're even more prevalent in our current economy. Can't understand these ideas without talking about this guy, Thorstein Veblen. He's kind of the father of institutional economics. There he is. He's so famous, he even got a type of good named after him, Veblen goods. Those are related to the idea of conspicuous consumption. What is that? People use goods as status symbols. The things you buy are often used as status symbols, or at least to say who you are, something about your identity, right? That is not present or possible in neoclassical economics, but it's everywhere in our modern consumer society. I'm sure you've noticed. Veblen goods act differently from normal goods because of conspicuous consumption, the consumption of goods to show other people. So if you think of it, conspicuous consumption is showing other people, communicating using goods, right? I'm this person, look at my symbol. That's not possible in neoclassical economics, because in neoclassical economics, people only look at prices and decide if they want something. That's the extent of communication in neoclassical economics in its purest form. Here's a normal good. Price is in the north-south axis there. As the price of a good goes up, people want to buy less of it. Why? Because it's expensive. Right? So quantity is in the left-right axis here. Quantity that people demand, they want to buy, goes up as the price goes down. Things get cheaper, you want more of a good. But a Veblen good is the opposite of that. You can see as price goes up for these types of goods, demand actually goes up. Okay, this is a stylized model of it. You can think of it by thinking of any status good. iPhones are actually often used as an example. Although there's never been a specific study on iPhones, there has on other goods that are Veblen goods. iPhones, it's been speculated, might be a Veblen good, right? If you use an iPhone, I didn't invent this critique, it's out there. Economists have talked about it and used it as an example. So iPhones are purchased and repurchased every couple of years with the newer version, and they're very expensive compared to other phones. But when people have done analyses, they just kind of work the same as other phones in general. But people will pay a premium to have the iPhone because it shows that they paid a premium to have an iPhone, that they're a member of a higher social status. When other people see your iPhone, it tells them a bit about who you are. So people will pay more. And theoretically, this has not really happened to be measured, but it's theorized with the iPhone, just like with other Veblen goods. If Apple actually dropped the price of iPhone to be half as much as any standard Android phone, a lot of people would stop buying the iPhone because it doesn't distinguish them as being high class, so to speak, anymore, right? So a lot of people buy that just because of that distinction. So any drop in price will result in those people buying less iPhones and not more. That's a Veblen good based on conspicuous consumption. Another common idea of old institutional economics is a bandwagon effect. That's when people want to consume what other people are consuming, or they want to be part of something. So in that case, demand for any good increases as other people use this good. Here's a good example. Here's the show you could go to. Do you want to go to this show, or do you want to go to this show? They're actually the same band and the same music. Most people want to go to the show on the right. I know some of you are saying, well, I don't like people, so I want to go to the left one. But most people want to go to the show on the right. But why? The vibe, the people. Everybody's there. And we've actually, this is used often in marketing. So is conspicuous consumption. I should back up and say these things are very common in our modern consumer capitalist society. Conspicuous consumption is used all of the time to try and get products to establish a sense of status to get people to buy them. Bandwagon effects are used all the time too. One of the classic ways to use a bandwagon effect is say this is your band or DJ, or I think it's a band, whatever it is, and you really want it to catch on. You pay all these people to come to your first show. After that, everybody says, yeah, that's where everybody is going. I'm going to go there too. And what's crazy is they actually come to like your music as well. So they might have first come just because they thought that's where everybody was, but with familiarity and they see other humans around there excited about your music, they come to like your music. It changes their preferences, the other people. So people have a preference for other people, but those other people change their preference for music. All sorts of studies like this, especially music is a good example, but I don't want you to think that's the only product that's this way, because this is used in advertising, especially online, all the time. People don't know what type of music to like generally, so you can hire bots to play that music all sorts of times on Spotify or whatever streaming service. And if people see that that song is popular, they think that they should like that song, and they come to actually like that song. This strategy is used all the time on social media, for example. People will prefer goods that have a lot of likes, even if those likes are artificially put there, right? That's a bandwagon effect, and it's used to manipulate consumers all of the time in our current economy. Path dependency. That's another old institutional economics idea. That's that people become trapped in buying specific goods because they've used them in the past, or they and other people they know have used them in the past as well. And you get trapped in using that, so you will use it into the future, even if it's an inferior good. We need some examples for this one, so here are some. Let's start on the one on the right, QWERTY. This is the QWERTY keyboard. Look down at your keyboard if you have one in front of you. You'll see QWERTY written on your keyboard, the first 6 letters of the keyboard. And I'm sure you've, especially when you were a kid, maybe learning how to use a keyboard, you're like, why doesn't this just go A, B, C, D, E, F, G? Well, the answer is when typewriters were first used, typewriters would jam if it was in that format, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because of the certain letters are commonly used together, and when those little typewriter arms come up, they hit each other and they jam more easily. So if you put letters in this specific form of the QWERTY keyboard, then typewriters won't jam anymore. You might be thinking to yourself, Tim, well, we don't use typewriters anymore. And that's true. It's more rational then for somebody to learn using a typewriter to have it be A, B, C, D, E, F, G. They'll know where to find the letters in the beginning. But that doesn't work because we're locked in because of path dependency. Everybody else is using QWERTY keyboards. They've used it for a while. They don't want to suddenly change. There's a big cost to changing that. Even computer manufacturers for them, there's a big cost in changing their manufacturing processes. We're just locked into this QWERTY thing. We'll probably be using it forever, even though it's probably less efficient than an ABCD format. That's path dependency. It exists in social media as well. You may, I don't know, so for some reason, maybe a political reason or whatever, decide you hate your social media. Maybe you're using X, and you decide you hate it. But it's really hard for you to quit that because you've been using it so long and you've established all your networks on there. If you leave that to a no-name social media site, first of all, there's no bandwagon effect going to help you out there because none of your friends are on that site. So who are you going to link to? And secondly, you lose all those links that you've worked so hard to get in the past. So we get locked into using one particular social media platform, and we can't move even if we want to. That's path dependency from old institutional economics. And I hope you can see how often these things are used, especially in marketing. So if you're taking an intro economics course of a neoclassical form, you're missing all of this. You get a sort of warped idea of how economies actually work. You think that you can just produce a good product at a good price and people will buy it. No, institutional economists have shown how that doesn't work. That's not enough. You need, if you're a marketer, to take advantage of these sort of conspicuous consumption, bandwagon, and path dependency effects. On the other hand, if you're designing or regulating, you're a policymaker regulating an economic system, you might want to protect consumers from predatory behavior being manipulated by these sorts of effects. So you might want to institute certain types of policy. But if you're interested in that, a standard intro to economics course doesn't really help you. It doesn't give you these ideas. So you need this institutional economics in addition to your standard neoclassical course to understand the real economy, and you don't go out there and start your business in a sort of naive state.